It was almost exactly a year ago that I talked here about gay and lesbian history before the Stonewall riots. And actually, you're going to see, there'll be a little review today. We're going to cover some of that same material. But that Sunday was the day of that mass murder in Orlando, Florida. And that was a really intense day, and we had some pretty intense conversation after my talk. I was really moved by that. And when you're a big nerd by me and you're really moved and you want to do something, you sit down and write an op-ed. So I sat down, and as soon as I got home, I wrote an op-ed and about the importance of bars in gay and lesbian history. And it got picked up by Time. And so it went all over the place, and within just a few hours, I got an email from the Birmingham Public Library asking me if I would come to Birmingham, Alabama, and give a talk on bars and gay and lesbian history. And I said, really? Birmingham, Alabama? Sure. So I went, and it was very well publicized, and there was a big crowd there, and C-SPAN came and filmed it. It's been broadcast nationally several times. It's been viewed online more than 800 times. And so I really want to thank the humanists of Silicon Valley for giving me this inspiration that turned into quite a boon for me. So that was great. In his invitation, the archivist in Birmingham wrote, "I was struck by the similarities between the role of gay nightclubs in the gay rights movement and African American churches in the civil rights movement." And I thought that was a pretty perceptive observation, as on the surface, this beautiful church in Montgomery, Alabama, doesn't seem to have a whole lot in common with the seedy gay bar on the right, operating illegally in Greenwich Village, New York. That beautiful church in Montgomery was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1974 in memory of Martin Luther King, Jr., who served as its pastor from 1954 to 1960. He helped to organize the Montgomery bus boycott from his office in that church's basement. So it seems pretty different from the bar, and yet this June, last June, President Barack Obama declared that seedy bar in New York City as the country's first national monument to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer rights. So that's quite a mouthful, and I just want to make sure we all know what that means. So LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and/or questioning. So that's what that refers to. So as it turns out, in this country, both gay bars and black churches have a very long history. Both have served as havens and sanctuaries. They've been the centers of solidarity, communication, and education. And as a result, they've also been the sites of arson, violence, and persecution. And yet, resistance to those very efforts to intimidate and squelch ultimately led to greater advancements in pride, rights, and freedoms. Even long before the modern gay bar, place has always played a powerful role in the lives of LGBTQ Americans. But today we're going to focus exclusively on the evolution of gay bars and nightclubs and the many roles they have played in American history. So, intimate same-sex relations had long been tolerated in American history. This was especially true of of single-sex communities like miners and cowboys. So here's the idealized version of the gold miners' dance, and in reality, here's a cowboy dance. The assumption among most straight people wasn't that these men were gay, just that they were just making do. They were having harmless fun. And the same was true of cross-dressers. Oh, it's just harmless fun. Now, this is not to say that same-sex sexuality was not occurring. It just wasn't on most straight people's radar. Now, Urban environments offered far more opportunities to seek out and act on same-sex desires than had ever been available before, when America was primarily a nation of family farmers. Urban environments were creating lots of space, such as public parks, for men to cruise and to find each other. The first YMCA opens in 1851. And men's bathhouses were doing a booming business in the Bowery by 1884. By the late 1880s, New York's Bleecker Street was home to at least 2 gay bars, the Slide and the Black Rabbit. By 1892, however, the term homosexual first appears in print, and it's defined as sexual perversion. With this invention of homosexuality, gradually comes an awareness that all these same-sex activities might not just be harmless fun. And they start to be investigated. So the New York Daily World denounced the Slide Bar on Bleecker Street in New York as a pit of shame, where wretches without moral sense or shame make nightly a public exhibition of their evil doings. In 1901, the New York Times reported the arrest of several of the patrons of the Black Rabbit and quoted anti-vice activist Anthony Comstock, who called the bar wicked, claiming that, quote, Sodom and Gomorrah would blush for shame to hear what depths of vice its habitués had descended. In 1903, we have the first raid on New York City bathhouse. 60 men were detained, 14 arrested. Now, New York was not the only place to feature early gay bars and clubs. They began to spring up in virtually every major city. The Dash opened in San Francisco, for example, in 1908. Even rural establishments called barrel houses or juke joints, if they were remote enough, offered some opportunities for non-typical sexual behaviors, far from the prying eyes of the disapproving church-going establishment. By no means for homosexuals only. They were nevertheless starting places for many women who later became relatively open lesbian blues singers, including Lucille Bogan, author of the explicitly lesbian song BD Women's Blues. BD stands for Bull Dagger. For most homosexuals, however, cities were the place to be. Although almost all clubs were racially segregated, Harlem resident and dancer Mabel Hampton said about the 1920s, New York was a great place to be a lesbian. You had a beautiful time up there. Oh, girl, you had some time up there. By 1932, this nightclub map would feature Gladys's Clam House. It's right above the square there, Gladys's Clam House. And Gladys was Gladys Bentley, who made no secret of her sexual preference for women. Later in the 1930s, Bentley was the featured singer at the Ubangi Club and noticed the gay male dancers on both sides of her. Gay bars and nightclubs were in major cities all across America, and they would become very important during World War II, especially clubs in the coastal cities, because in small towns and farmhouses all across America, most homosexuals were deeply closeted. In their isolation, they believed they were the only ones to have these feelings, and they feared what others said were true, that homosexuals were dangerous perverts. Closeted gays and lesbians from all over the United States left their small towns to serve their country, either by enlisting in the military during World War II or taking up war production jobs in the coastal cities. So at some point, most ended up in or near a coastal city, and almost all ended up in some city, very often for the very first time. So many closeted gays during World War II are going to go to their first gay bar. So there's the San Francisco's Black Cat Cafe. Many lesbians are going to go to their first lesbian bar. You'll notice the top performer here is Gladys Bentley. She's still performing in the 40s. They find that they are not the only ones, that there are lots of people who are atypical sexually and who are not perverted, deviant criminals, but good, loyal Americans who are serving their country well in time of need. When the war is over, they don't want to return to their small towns and small town closets. Many settle instead in the urban cities where they first experienced some self-acceptance. So they're poised for a whole new era. But instead of having the gay liberation movement then, they're going to have to endure about 25 more years of repression. After their hopes were raised by World War II, the Cold War comes along, and this is a particularly horrible time to be gay, lesbian, transgender, or bisexual in the United States. Gay men and lesbians were seen as particular risks to national security. Quote, sexual perverts who have infiltrated our government in recent years are perhaps as dangerous as the actual communists. And this is when the communist witch hunt is at full throttle. Atypical sexuality was grounds for immediate and permanent dismissal. Ultimately, this includes positions in government like postal carriers, public school teachers. And so we'll see that most homosexuals are going to remain in the closet during this period. So what to do then with that nascent pride and that sense of identity that had been born during World War II? I mean, you can't unring the bell. You can't unlearn something once you have learned it. So the gay bar becomes more important than ever, but also scarier. Scarier because of police raids. It was illegal to serve an alcoholic drink to a homosexual because they were deemed inherently disorderly. And remember that homosexuality itself is not only considered unnatural and immoral, it's illegal. And not just sex acts, but any same-sex conduct, like holding hands, can be deemed lewd and lascivious behavior. Now, you can imagine what will happen to you if you get your name, or God forbid, your picture in the paper after being arrested in such a raid. So you'll note the very top headline there, 8 teachers, suburb principal seized. So those careers are over. If you were married, and most closeted homosexuals were, this is immediate grounds for divorce, with the spouse getting sole custody of the children. You can lose your job, lose your apartment, be cut out by your church, by your friends, and that's even if the charges are dropped. If the charges are pressed, you're going to face the prospect of a jury trial. So virtually everyone facing a morals charge would plead to a lower misdemeanor, drunk and disorderly, for example, or willingly pay a fine rather than go to trial. You could also be committed to a mental hospital. This is especially true for young people, to be cured of your illness. This could involve electroshock therapy, various forms of aversion therapy, including insulin injections and all kinds of stuff. So getting caught in a gay bar is a very quick way to ruin your life. So why go? Why do they thrive? Gays and lesbians who came of age in the 40s, 50s, and 60s speak over and over and over again of how they risked their reputations, their marriages, their families, their livelihoods by going to gay bars, because the gay bars saved their lives. They kept them from despairing that they were the only ones, kept them from believing that society was right, that they were sick and criminal and would be better off dead. In the bars and nightclubs, they found hookups and one-night stands. They also found partners and lovers and friends who accepted them as they were. They didn't have to carry out the exhausting work of pretending to be straight. They could be themselves. And being true to yourself is very precious and it's worth a lot of risk. Lesbians during the period suffered double discrimination. Even most gay men saw women as inferior. In the days before widespread feminism, the lesbian bar was the truly rare place where women were not pressured to cater to men. A lesbian in the 1940s said, "We could throw off our girdles, dresses, and high heels," which was the uniform virtually required of all women. Lesbians could wear pants and be free from straight men's unwanted sexual attention. The lesbian bar led to the creation of a whole alternate society and culture. And for many working-class lesbians, that was the world of the butch femme. And which always is very confusing to my students. If you're going to be a lesbian in the 50s, why this very strict, you have to be butch or femme? I mean, you're already so outside of society's rules. But it offered some surprising protections. It tells lesbians how to dress, how to behave, and undercover cops who posed as butch or femmes were so bad at it that they could keep them out of the lesbian bars. As one regular said, the lesbian bar, quote, "was my world, and that other world was not real." An early challenge to homophobic laws grew out of the police harassment of the owner and the patrons of San Francisco's Black Cat. The owner took the state to court, and in 1951, the California Supreme Court said, quote, "Something more must be shown than that many of his patrons are homosexuals and that they used his restaurant and bar as a meeting place. That alone is not criminal." Basically, gays can legally gather in California bars. But the California court also confirmed that gay bars could be closed with, quote, "proof of the commission of illegal or immoral acts on the premises." And this includes same-sex kissing or even touching. So police harassment continues. Early in the 1950s, some very brave gay men and lesbians formed the organizations the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis and began to fight back against this government treatment, government discrimination. Bars increasingly became the settings for crucial battles in the campaign for gay rights. And perhaps the least known but most important took place inside this bar, Julius in New York City. On April 21st, 1966, Mattachine staged a sip-in. It's like a sit-in, only involves alcohol. So they bring a photographer, and they go to the bar, and they say to the bartender, "We are gay men, and we want a drink." It's a gay bar. But he sees the photographer, places his hand over the glass, and says, "No, you've identified as gay. I can't serve you." So Mattachine then challenged in court the laws that prohibited serving alcoholic beverages to gays. And the court ruling in that case said that gays could peaceably assemble at bars in New York, establishing a new era of licensed, legally operating bars. And it included a new gay bar in 1967, only a block away from Julius, the Stonewall Inn. Now, just as lesbians often rejected or were often rejected or discriminated against in some gay men's bars, gays and lesbians of color faced racial as well as sexual discrimination. And transgender people were virtually pariahs, not accepted even in many gay bars. Now, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Compton's Cafeteria, and I know this is cheating because it's not really a bar, but it fits in the story so well. I'm just going to stretch this a bit. So it was a diner in San Francisco's Tenderloin District, and one of the few places where drag queens and transgender people congregated publicly in the city. Cross-dressing was illegal, so police regularly raided the place. In August of 1966, just a few months after the sip-in at Julius, some patrons began picketing the cafeteria because the management kept calling the police to arrest the cross-dressing customers. During an attempted arrest, the customers began to fight back, and a riot broke out. It's one of the first known efforts by transgender people to stand up to abuse and discrimination by the police. And there is something very empowering about standing up for yourself. Gay bars were the sites of that kind of empowerment. They were life-saving, and they were fun, despite the fact that they still represented real danger in the form of constant raids and police harassment. It was no longer illegal to serve an openly gay person a drink, but atypical sexual activity in any form of touching remained illegal. Now, in 1962, Illinois became the first state in the United States to decriminalize homosexual acts between consenting adults in private. But it wasn't until 2003 that the Supreme Court declares the sodomy law is still enforced by many states to be unconstitutional. So it's a long period for this harassment to go on. This means that people in gay bars could be harassed by police for drunken and for all kinds of stuff. Obscene behavior, lewd conduct, drunken disorderly, all kinds of stuff. A major turning point in LGBTQ history started at the Stonewall Inn at about 1:20 in the morning on June 28, 1969. The Stonewall was a gay bar in Greenwich Village, and two of the key words here are class and race. Who are the patrons of this bar? Working class people, drag queens, butch lesbians. I have a rougher crowd. Some are people of color. They've all been deemed by whites to be lower class in one way or another. And significantly, many are openly gay. They aren't terrified of being outed. They're not going to lose their jobs, their families, their homes because of the way that they're already living. So now the Stonewall had been raided several times because it had been operating without a liquor license. Lots of bars did this. It was cheaper to pay off the police than it was to pay for the liquor license. So they enter the Stonewall Inn and they start a standard raid, and the patrons have had enough. And they begin rioting inside the bar, and then it spills out into the street, and they throw bricks and bottles, and they set fires, and the press is astonished by this. But the impact is really quite exhilarating. And so the next night they come back and they do it again, and then they do it a third night. And so it was just kind of this amazing revelation, and the word spreads through the press. This is a very snotty article, but nevertheless, word was getting out that so. You know, why is this such a big deal? It was a big deal for those who participated. It's like we fought back against an injustice, just like all these other oppressed people have been doing in the civil rights movement. It's like, yes, you know, for some reason, fighting back, you know, violence seems to generate respect, or at least attention in this country. A decade later, the poet Allen Ginsberg remembered, you know, he's talking about the riots, the guys were so beautiful. They'd lost that wounded look that fags all had 10 years ago. So what made this riot memorable and meaningful, even as the sip-in at Julius and the Compton Cafeteria riot faded from public memory? And I think it wasn't so much the riot itself, it's what happens immediately afterwards. And one thing is the creation of the Gay Liberation Front that really wants to maximize on this sense of pride and wanting to do something. But I would also say that, and that's going to get more media attention, but I think the most important thing was a year later, there was a commemorative march. And these commemorative marches have been held every year in late June ever since. And lots of people that I know march in pride parades having no idea this is commemorating the Stonewall riots, but they are going to, they're going to start in 1970 and continue, and now they're held all over the world. This is the first ones. There was an old expression used to reveal one's homosexuality. It was called letting a hairpin drop. Oh, he's let a hairpin drop. Stonewall was called the hairpin drop heard around the world. All right, as gays and lesbians came out of the closet. And publications and organizations proliferated, and gay bars are increasingly visible and popular sites for socializing and political organizing, and also sites for violence. People leaving bars were frequently victims of street violence, gay bashings, and so forth. The Pulse Bar in Orlando was not the first to be the site of a mass murder. In 1973, an arsonist set fire to the gay bar, the Upstairs Lounge in New Orleans, killing 32. Despite the large number of fatalities, no politician, not the mayor or the governor, certainly not the president, expressed sympathy or made any kind of statement. It was likely set by a psychologically unstable patron, but we'll never know for sure because the police were not interested in investigating, and that patron committed suicide the following year. According to Upstairs Lounge fire survivor Mike Moreau, what happened to us had to be kept so private. The public didn't want to know about it, and if they heard about it, they didn't care, saying things like, oh, thank God they're gone, they deserved it. Yet the following year, 1974, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders of the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. As one gay activist put it, we all went to bed sick and the next morning woke up well. Discrimination, nevertheless, continues throughout the 70s and beyond, and gays and lesbians continue to flock to gay bars and nightclubs. Alison Bechtel, cartoonist, author of the graphic memoir Fun Home, remembered that in 1980, my first gay bar was Satan's in Akron, Ohio. I was used to feeling like a total alien when I was in any kind of social group. But that night, in the large mixed crowd, I experienced the profound existential relief for once of not being the only queer. A year later, in 1981, I moved to New York. There was a lot of routine anti-gay hostility on the street. Even in Sheridan Square on a weekend night, you'd get hassled for holding hands. But then you'd step past the bouncer at the Duchess, and you were home free. The bar had its own perils, but it afforded me the space to just be with my guard down, and that was salvation. A year after Bechtel started going to the Duchess, some of its patrons staged a protest of the ongoing harassment by the liquor board. Well, why be so protective of a bar? I think this sign kind of says it all. Come in here. All your gay bar dreams come true. Come on in. Or disappointing real life that way. You know, come on in. This is the place to be. Now, a huge crisis hits the gay community in the early 1980s, the HIV/AIDS crisis. And in many cities, the bathhouses were closed as ground zero for spreading the disease. Gay bars became some of the most important centers for not only sharing information about safer sex practices, but for planning protests, in particular demanding that the government quicken the pace of the development and testing of new drugs. Many gay bar patrons became members of ACT UP, the AIDS coalition to unleash power. Potter and designer Jonathan Adler remembered being in a gay bar in Providence, Rhode Island, a city long known for being a center of gay culture. He was, quote, frivolously dancing to Bronski Beat. In walks a dude from New York who was a member of ACT UP, wearing a leather jacket that said, "Don't tread on me." It was a defining moment for me. It was about gay empowerment. It was not about getting messed with, and it was about the importance of addressing an existential crisis head-on. I moved to New York the next year. Throughout the height of HIV/AIDS epidemic, even today, gay bars and nightclubs continued to play a crucial role in the lives of LGBTQ Americans. Author Andrew Solomon remembered, "Ease and dignity had seemed incompatible with my gayness until my sweaty June bar visit sent me on a new path, one that much later led me to marrying my husband, having our children, and becoming an activist for LGBTQ rights." CNN anchor Don Lemon remembered, "I was deeply closeted in college. Everybody was. It was the 1980s. It was the South. And people didn't come out then as quickly as they do now. After I'd built up the liquid courage to do it, to go to a gay bar in Baton Rouge, I never turned back. It was gay heaven. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I was finally at home." Television host Andy Cohen said, even of the 1990s, "It was quite literally like stepping into another world. It's where I built a community of friends. Pre-internet, gay bars were integral to our social development. They were an escape from the often unfriendly outside world, packed every night of the week, and everyone inside was a friend." According to actress and musician Carrie Brownstein, a gay bar is ours. It's ours like putty. It's ours like clay. The environment is both ridiculous and profound, but we get to decide when it's one or both or neither. Only away from the glare of homophobia could we experience malleability, a flexing of the self, a full rotation. Who knew there were 360 degrees? Lori Stevens of Tennessee states, "There's a monthly queer dance party hosted at a local bar here in East Nashville. Since many of us don't or can't go to church, bars and clubs have always been the central gathering places for us. They have an almost spiritual quality." Jason Sakaris of Chicago agrees. "Calling them sacred spaces isn't hyperbole. I didn't feel like it was finally okay to be myself the first time I went to church or to the movies or the post office or the first day of kindergarten or my first company Christmas party. The first time I finally felt like I didn't have to watch what I said or police who I looked at or feel shameful for who I was attracted to was the first time I set foot in a gay bar." Emily Sullivan recalled, "Where I grew up in rural Virginia, there is no safe space for LGBT citizens, most of whom are invisible. My move to Brooklyn brought me shelter. Because I grew up in a town that made my sexuality feel painful, I can't take these spaces for granted in what they offer LGBT people. They are solace, they are accepting, they are safety." Others spoke of the importance of gay and lesbian bars catering to people of color. According to Lori Stevens of Nashville, "As someone who is queer and Latina, these spaces are even more important. The mainstream LGBT community is often very white, and I know it's not something they intend. But we don't get a lot of white folks standing up and saying things like, 'Immigration is an LGBT issue,' even though it is. A lot of people who were killed and wounded in Orlando were identified as immigrants, and some of them undocumented. That's a whole other level of barriers for these families." So, like many popular LGBTQ clubs, Pulse in Orlando, Florida, served as a welcoming place to party for gays and lesbians who weren't white or middle to upper class. Pulse not only welcomed the area's large immigrant population, it also was a community partner, hosting a variety of social and educational events, including, for example, breast cancer awareness, HIV/AIDS prevention. According to its website, Pulse Orlando served as a driving force within the LGBT community, seeking to make strides towards equality awareness and love for all. The mass shooting there on June 12, 2016, resulted in the deaths of these 49 people. It was a particularly outrageous violation of the notion of gay bars as places of safety in a hostile, homophobic world. Jake Sakaris summed up the Orlando massacre like this: "If you don't know what we're feeling, think of the place in your life where you felt most comfortable and safe and loved. It's probably the house you grew up in. Now imagine someone burning that house to the ground with your family inside because he hates you. that feeling is pretty close to how we feel right now. I think it must have been a little bit like many African Americans felt after the 1953 bombing that killed 4 little girls in a church in Birmingham. Their sacred place had been violated, and some of their youngest and most vulnerable had been killed. And so many of them went to church to find solace and comfort and community. Gays, too, refused to allow their sacred spaces to become sites of fear. After the killings, they flocked to clubs and bars to grieve and to find solidarity and to reaffirm that they would not be intimidated back into the closet. So here's the tweet from Orlando. "You cannot silence us. You cannot destroy us. We are not going anywhere." A survivor of the upstairs lounge arson fire said, "To see the outpouring of love and support that all these poor Pulse families have gotten is fantastic. They are hurting in the same way that we hurt, but at least they know that the world supports them and understands their grief." He continued, "President Obama actually addressed the nation, which I thought was very moving. In his last will and testament, openly gay San Francisco City Supervisor Harvey Milk wrote, 'If a bullet should enter my brain, let that bullet destroy every closet door. Burst down these closet doors once and for all,' he urged, 'and stand up and start to fight.' The attack on Pulse provoked the same kind of response that followed Milk's assassination. The Pulse massacre prompted many closeted gays to finally come out." Now, some today are worried about the future of the gay bar. Shortly before the massacre at Pulse, I gave the keynote at a gay conference in San Francisco, talking about the importance of place in gay and lesbian history. And during the Q&A, I was asked what I thought of Grindr and other electronic apps that are taking the place of some gay bars as ways to hook up. And I explained that I was no expert. I had recently asked my daughter how her Kindle date went. She rolled her eyes and said, "Mother, you mean my Tinder date?" So I'm completely hopeless on this. But I think my conference questioner wanted me to disavow Grindr as nothing more than an avenue for casual sex. But I was hesitant to do so. Gay bars were once disdained for the same reason. I'm certainly no expert on Grindr, but this new book about rural gays and lesbians in rural communities impressed upon me deeply the importance of the internet in making many gay men and lesbians, especially those isolated or closeted in small towns, feel less alone, more like members of an accepting and supportive community. So even a brief history of gay bars and nightclubs reveals the importance of community, of the human need for acceptance and safety. Like the Black church, the gay bar has been the site of solidarity and spiritual renewal. It's been the subject of attack, but also served as a site for fostering pride, for planning to overcome hatred and discrimination, and to promote safety and acceptance. Gay bars and nightclubs are unique places and spaces that continue to foster gay pride, facilitate progress, and promote feelings of belonging, solidarity, and joy. So, thank you.
So we'll now have Q&A. In order to record the questions along with the answers, please wait for the microphone before asking questions. When you have the microphone, remember to hold it close to your mouth, and also please identify yourself before asking your question. Are there any questions?
I have 3 questions. First, do you have any idea of what the proportion, the percentage of gays are in the human population? That's the first question. The second one is that I understand this is a genetic trait. Now, since the gays do not breed, how in the world can this be propagated unless all of us have the same gene? That's the second question. My third one is, what is the experience with the gays adopting kids, which I think is very useful.
Okay, let me see if I can remember them, and then I'll see if I can answer them. So the first one, what is the percentage? Oh boy, the estimates range so widely. They really range. Well, I've heard 4%, 10%, 12%. I've heard all. Yeah. So, and a lot of this depends on definition and so forth.
But it's all over the planet.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Well, even in places where it's a death penalty issue, it's still happening. So yeah. So the genetic question, I feel strongly about this genetic question. I wrote an op-ed about this. I got a lot of hate mail about it. The genetic question was because they were doing some testing of sheep that were having same-sex relations, and this sheep owners were mad because they wanted them to be propagating. It's like, what's happening to these gay sheep? What's going on? So they were doing these experiments and trying to figure this out and so forth. What makes gay? And it was really interesting because it wasn't about homosexuality as a sin or whatever. It was just like, what's going on here, and is this genetic or not? And my argument about that question that comes up a lot is. I stole from Frank Kameny, the great activist, who said, what difference does it make whether it's genetic or not? It is. It is what it is. So his argument is, because what his fear was that if it turned out to be genetic, then it would be seen as either a defect or something that could be, fixed or changed. And he said, what difference does it make? Why are we looking for this to resolve this question? He said, we don't we don't say let's solve our civil rights problems by bleaching the Negro and making them all the same. We don't try to end anti-Semitism by converting the Jews to Christianity. He says, we just want our rights for who we are. It doesn't make any difference why we're Negro, why we're Jewish, why we're whatever else. We are who we are. So I like that because I think that it doesn't matter to me if it's genetic, if it's a choice, it's a combination of any of these things. It is. It's always been. It is, and that's kind of all that matters, in my view. Yeah.
How about adopting kids?
Oh, this is a good question because there was a lot of anticipation that this would be terrible for children. And from the studies that have been done, it's like, no, these tend to be, because there's a lot of very careful thought that gay parents who are kind of pioneering this or putting into being parents, they've actually have very well adjusted, all kids can have problems, but that generally speaking, these tend to be more solid families and the children tend to be more stable and secure. And I believe, yes. And certainly, everybody can screw up parenting, but so I don't think that homosexuals are necessarily better parents, but I think they're very conscientious parents right now as this is moving forward, and I think that is the answer to that.
Hi.
I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah, I find your response, because I had a question about the genetics also, very, fair-minded. It's how I think about atheist and religious. Like, why even talking about it? Who cares? Do something. Mm-hmm. But I was going to wonder if you had any comments on, I was over at the Ethical Culture Society, I don't know, a year and a half ago, and there was a family there and a transgender, now woman, born male, and there was, do you have any thoughts about those twins that grew up together, the same household, the same family, and one became transgender and one stayed their original sex? Just
are you talking about the male twins that?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that is such. If we're talking about the same case, it's a really skewed case because they were born male twins. One of them had a very badly botched circumcision. And so they said, look, his penis is not, we're not going to be able to salvage it, and so we're going to turn him into a girl, and did that. So it wasn't like this was imposed on this child. And in the end, that child said, once he heard the story, said, "No wonder I've been so miserable as a girl all my life," and chose to be male even without a penis. And it's a whole big thing. But I don't think it's a very it's not a representative, because this was someone who was forced to become opposite of what he was born to be. Oh. So I think it just doesn't kind of fit. The doctor in charge of that case tried to make it into all kinds of things, but I don't think it was well understood.
That's just unconscionable.
Yes. Yes.
I hadn't heard that about those twins, and I often wondered how that case flew in the face of the notion that there is a genetic component to homosexuality. And I understand that case a lot better, and that was the only one that was really concerning me. Yeah. I'm so glad you're here today. Where did you get all these wonderful photos?
Well, this is the problem with the internet. You know, I get going on this, and 12 hours later, I think, okay, I got to stop. It's like, oh, this is maybe I can find one more. Well, maybe I can find more. And then I just get going on this, and then I think, okay, is this legal? Can I do this? And I think, well, so far the PowerPoint police have not come and said you can't do that, but I try to put down, you know, where I get them and so forth as much as I can. But you know, once you start looking, once you go down that rabbit hole, there's all kinds of stuff, and then it leads you to the next link, and yeah. But and sometimes I wonder in my classes, I've gotten so PowerPoint intensive that I wonder if they're a distraction. But I think people would much rather have something to look at and make it, you know, seem more real. Yeah. Yeah.
I was very interested in what you had to say and what Frank Kameny had to say. I agree with him 100%. I hadn't even thought it out. But of course, what difference does it make whether there's a genetic component or if it's strictly environmental? In terms of politics and culture, it should not make any difference. But I can interject here a little bit that I really think that there is a strong genetic component to homosexuality. I often wonder, who were my ancestors that contributed to my XY chromosomal material that made me endow my son, Mark, with homosexuality? I frankly think that it came from my side of the family. I don't know why. Maybe it's just because I didn't know his father's side of the family very well. But I think that, of course, gay people should be openly gay and should be proud of their sexuality and proud of their all of their heterosexual as well as their homosexual family members. I'm so glad to hear this presentation today. Do you also think that there is a genetic component to homosexuality?
I really don't know. I've kind of purposely not explored that because I'm sticking with the I don't really care, and it doesn't matter why people are how they are. They just are. But well, it's just you know, I mean, I've had to give this a lot of thought because I teach gay and lesbian history, and a number of my students say, well, but wouldn't it be great if there was a gene that could be identified? Then we could say, look, once and for all, it's not a choice. This is what it is. And I thought, well, but for like political lesbians, it is a choice. Does this mean then that they're, I mean, it just opens up a whole can of worms that I just don't even want to go there.
That's true. I've noted, pardon me for hogging the mic here for a second, I've noticed that in my process of working with gay people as a result of my son's death, he was a rugby player and a gay man, openly gay, and now he's even more openly gay post-mortem because of his mom. I've noticed that there are very, very many, inordinate number of brilliant gay people, brilliant artists, thinkers, philosophers, writers, and activists. It seems to me that that is remarkably, it's a marker, it seems to me, of, I wonder if there's a genetic component I'm not a geneticist, but I wonder if there is something else besides just the marker for, or the gene for homosexuality, if there's a bundle of genes that go together.
Well, there certainly is a theory that that is true, and that people who are, some of these really brilliant homosexuals, in part are so brilliant and have been so successful because they're not getting married and having kids and so forth. Well, obviously that's not true anymore. And so some is just like, well, no, this was just sort of aided along by by discrimination against homosexuals. So again, I think there are brilliant homosexuals, brilliant straight people, you know. So you know, and it's also well, Don't get me going on this. I can go on far too long.
How were you received in Birmingham during your talk?
You know, that was a really interesting question. I didn't know what to expect in Birmingham, Alabama. There were about 70 people at this talk. And they wrote me lovely emails afterwards that all kinds of... The crazy thing about being in Birmingham is every time I'd go for a walk, every person first greets you and says, hey, how y'all doing? How's your mama? You know, all this stuff. And then they say, welcome to Alabama, or where are y'all from? And I thought, what? What is it about me that clearly I'm not from? And finally I recognized I was walking way too fast. It's hot, it's sultry, they're all walking along briskly, you know, walking along. But no, I was very pleasantly surprised. I was walking actually to the talk, and someone stopped me and said, you know, where are y'all from and so forth, what you doing here? And I said, I'm going to give this talk on gay bars. And he just said, well, God bless you. And so I said, well, thank you very much. Went on my way. But no, I was really, I was very pleasantly surprised, and the archivist who invited me was very pleasantly surprised, because he was hoping this could be the beginning of a series on gay and lesbian talks, and if it had ended up being controversial or no one had come or, you know, whatever else. The one thing that went really, really wrong was in the middle of the talk, and the computer was way over there. My clicker went out, and so I couldn't advance the slides. So I was like, ah. So I changed the batteries. Didn't work. So I just thought, oh, I thought, well, just talk. You don't have to have these slides. I thought, no, I worked so hard. So about the time I was about to have a breakdown, this nice woman who was helping who worked with the archivist came, sat down on the floor, reached her hand up, poised it above the button, and just gave me the nod. And so then, for the rest of it, I just told her when to press the button. So if you want to see this, it's in the tape that's on C-SPAN online. They didn't cut it out. So you can see me having a breakdown during the middle of a talk. So not my greatest moment, but we did continue on. So no, it went surprisingly well, I felt. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, maybe this is a dumb question, but what does queer mean, and what's the difference between that and gay?
Well, queer is, boy, you've opened up a real, it's not a stupid question, it's a very good question, it's a very complicated question. But queer is kind of the big umbrella term. So there are people who say, do we really have to go through that whole alphabet, L, B, G, T, can't we just all just be queer? You know, just anything that is not straight, typical sexuality, can't we just do that? But then there are like a number of lesbians that I know who say, oh, no, 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 no. We are not being erased from this again. We want that word lesbian in there, and we are different from gay men, and you know, so some of it's generational, I think, but I think it represents sort of a, you know, that this is not one single movement. Different people have different ideas. But more among younger people, I think there is more of an effort to go more the queer umbrella term.
Sounds sort of political.
It is very political. Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I understand the origin of that word is partially when oppressed groups want to reclaim some pride, they'll take derogatory terms used for themselves and to reclaim it and to contextualize it.
Yeah, that used to be a very derisive term. Yeah, yeah. Queer. You know, yeah. Queer's a $3 bill. It was yeah. So yeah, it's like the Black Power movement taking on the word black, which had also been as a derogatory term. Yeah.
It used to be very common that if there was any problem with the circumcision, or a child was born with something strange, that they would just go ahead and take it off. They didn't realize that there was something internal that they were damaging. Mm-hmm. They just used to do it quite commonly.
Well, and also, I was surprised to learn how many people are born with kind of ambiguous genitalia. And so it used to be, okay, this baby looks more like a girl, so we'll do that surgery, or more like a boy, and we'll do that surgery. And now the trend is much more, this baby is what it is, let's just let it alone. But there was the sense that this was a huge disservice, and that everybody had to be male or female, and you go down that path. Yeah.
Speaking of the genetic issue, not only sheep, but homosexuality is widespread through the animal kingdom.
Oh, it is. I wrote an essay on a book about this, and my essay is pretty good, but the best essay in there, the headline or the title was, "We're deer, we're queer, get used to it," which I just thought was hilarious, you know, this notion of these activist deer. But that has been one of the most powerful arguments. If this is unnatural, why is it so pervasive throughout nature, throughout plant species, animal species, and so forth? Yeah.
I was wondering now that same-sex marriage is available everywhere, how's that working out? You know, in relationship to divorce rates or people who got married for the symbolism, and then it's like a year later, oh my God, I'm married. You know, and then that type of thing. You know, can you just?
Well, I think my understanding is that I don't know the statistics on this, but there are still people who won't get married because they say it's it's an archaic system and so forth, and that's true for straights and gays. I think one of the most important things that gay marriage did was to create gay divorce, because we had the same thing in gay couples we had in straight couples, where one would, help the other one through school, be taking care of things at home more and so forth. And then when the doctor, whoever it was, left, then there was no option, there was no sense of, sharing assets or whatever else. So I think that gay divorce is an important element of gay marriage. I know what you're asking but my understanding is it's not been any particularly more successful or less successful than straight marriage. Certainly it's like most marriages, there's a bunch that are the starter marriages, they last like a year or two and then they're done, and then there are the ones that last forever, and I think we're seeing that's kind of human as opposed to just to any particular type of sexuality. Yeah.
My name is Roy Elder, and I've seen and heard of a couple of sex parties where they trade, and there is, in some of these parties I heard, there is absolutely no male to male, but let's have female to female. What is that phenomenon?
Well, I think that this is very, very big in porn. The idea that that women who are having sex with each other really just want a man to sort of titillating and so forth. They never use unattractive women in this scenario. They're always these lesbians, if they just really had a real man, they would come around. So I think that this is kind of part of some old heterosexual male fantasies and so forth. I mean, I'm no expert on this, but that's my initial gut reaction. Yeah.
Since we live in a patriarchal system, can you just give your insight on how does it play out in this kind of environment? Because women are the second-class citizen because of the patriarchy. And a patriarchal system versus the matriarchal systems, how people growing up with different sexual orientation will be treated. Do you have any?
Well, I think we've certainly in this country, which is the only history I know, we've seen how that patriarchal system had that very much that gender divide, you're male or female, and that under a patriarchy the males are superior, females are inferior. I mean, we've seen that throughout American history. One of the things that I think has been really exciting in gay and lesbian history is that so many of the women in NOW and some of the early feminist movements were lesbians, saying, look, we know a lot about patriarchy. We know that there are other ways of doing things. And I think that Betty Friedan and some others kind of tried to shuttle them off to the side. But I think some of the greatest challenges that we've seen to patriarchy have come from gay men and lesbians saying, look, there's another way to do this, and let us show you what that is. I think it's one of their sort of unsung accomplishments.
Well, there's a saying. I wonder what you would think of that. Is that true? They say, what does a man bring on, a gay man bring to a second date? And the answer is, what second date? And what does a woman bring to a second date a U-Haul.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is actually, I tell that joke in my gay and lesbian class to make a very important point, that one of the things that happened, I think, particularly in the 70s and 80s, was that, you know, you can be gay or lesbian, you still grow up in this society, and men were told that they're very sexual, and women were told they're very relationship oriented. I don't think it should surprise us that would be sort of in this sort of first flowering of gay liberation, that men would really be acting on their way of what it means to be male, and women would be acting on their way of what they're told it means to be female. I think that we don't see that as extreme anymore. I think that, well, I think the HIV/AIDS crisis certainly changed a lot of things in that regard as well. But I think that those two things really prove that you're never outside the system. I mean, even if you are homosexual in a heterosexual society, and you feel like an outsider, there are still elements of it that you take in. So, and this was also used to say, oh, well, men are just more sexual than women. And I really don't think that is the case, but I think we're acculturated to have different types of relationships. What's acceptable for men is not acceptable for women. You know, if a young man has a whole bunch of sexual partners with women, he's a stud. If he's a player. If a young woman has a bunch of different sexual partners with men, what is she?
A slut.
She's a slut. I mean, we all know this double standard. You know, everybody knows that one. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation and for answering our questions. Please feel free to get to know us better while we are waiting for lunch to be ready, and to join us at the speakers table for lunch and further discussion.
Thank you very much.